Yes, yes. Welcome to another episode of The Grove. Today on the show, we have Yangbo Du. He's a friend of mine. He actually works directing partnerships at a company called Innovo. And what Innovo does, I still don't know because we didn't get into anything about his professional life, his experience scaling startups. What we actually got into was his very extremely deep knowledge of the history of nuclear in the United States and a little bit all over the world, but mainly the United States. It's incredibly fascinating, very educational conversation with Yangbo. And I look forward to the next ones where we cover other information about his own story. So a little less traditional, but extremely for the Grove, but extremely educational nonetheless. Elaborate talks about a lot of different frameworks. There's a lot of information. I elaborate on it on the blog, on our newsletter that you can subscribe to in the description. Thank you to our partners, Craze and Friends, for producing, and Clean Tech Growth Lab for making this all possible. If you're looking to grow in clean tech, it's Clean Tech Growth Lab. Any other industry, it's Craze and Friends. And now, I bring you Yangbo.
All right. Welcome to the episode. Thank you, partners. Shout it out just before camera here. We have a very special guest today, Yangbo Du. Welcome.
Yeah. Hello there. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, no one else there knows what you're in for. Yangbo and I met at a networking event a couple weeks ago, and 2 minutes into the conversation, I knew that we had to. I wish we were recording in the moment.
Yes, indeed.
There's just so much knowledge that you possess about climate change, specifically nuclear, and I mean everything else. But I'm excited to talk about nuclear. So for everyone that doesn't know yet, do you give a brief introduction of yourself?
Yes, and just very broadly, I've been in various capacities in sustainability, social enterprise, sustainable development, any of these adjacent areas for about 20 years now, a little over, with 6 years research in energy and environmental economics and policy. And that's actually where I was most active as far as nuclear is concerned. And then most of the 2010s, I was co-founding various startups, one after another, before transitioning over to the impact finance side of things around project preparation. So somewhat full circle, except instead of purely academic, it's now fully in the private sector, really focusing on what can be done in the immediate term to achieve 2030 climate targets.
Got it. So a lot of what we talked about on this podcast are how to bring ideas into the world, specifically around climate change, and that involves a lot more than just how to market, how to sell, these types of things. And I think from a very high level point of view, there's a very complex environment that a founder needs to be successful within. Considering regulations, considering policy, considering then market dynamics and buyers, and all of those types of things. And so the education that you got about nuclear specifically, I think contributes a lot to understanding what makes it, what environment makes it possible for nuclear to be successful. And then also, asking the question of where does it fit and do we even want it to be successful? So if we want to start out, because I'm interested in also your experiences with the startups, but could you start at like the role of nuclear in the U.S.?
Yes, to just set the stage here with nuclear, that the U.S., above all, was one of the early movers in nuclear for power generation. The first reactor that came online was back in 1957 in Shippingport, Pennsylvania. And it was a direct, yes, indeed, Shippingport, Pennsylvania, almost the Ohio border. on the Ohio River, not too far downstream from Pittsburgh, actually. And it was a direct derivative of reactors used by the U.S. Navy in that period on submarines and very soon aircraft carriers. So for those who have heard questions about small modular reactors today, well, those were original SMRs, small modular reactors. They were no more than 20 to 25 megawatts, so mostly designed for shipboard propulsion.
Is that the definition of?
The definition varies a lot, so there's some that go even smaller, some that get even larger than that. By the 60s, what was becoming evident is that there were definitely economies of scale with larger reactor designs, which is actually why in the course of the 60s, there started a shift towards larger reactors. So instead of tens of megawatts capacity, you're now looking at hundreds. And if we just isolate it to all of the reactors that are still operating today, the earliest, or let's say more recently, because some of the those from the early ones have already been decommissioned. But from the late 60s onwards, those that were purpose-built for commercial power generation, those were in the 500 to 600 megawatt range. And then later ones as you got in the 70s, later ones were specified at even 800, even close to a gigawatt.
So just to put it into perspective, how much power is that? Like how many homes? How many people? Roughly is that? Those metrics. Like how can you put it in perspective about how much energy that?
Well, to just give you an idea, and when actually I was living in the state of Illinois 20 years ago, that the state of Illinois had a handful. You could count the number of nuclear plants on one hand in the state of Illinois. So back then, the active ones were Byron, Braidwood, Dresden, Cordova, and Clinton. Those are 5 reactors, 5 plants. And if you count the total number of reactors at the Byron and the Braidwood plants and the Byron, Braidwood, and Cordova facilities, each of them had 2 reactors. So you got 8 nuclear reactors, and that provided roughly half of the electricity load in the state of Illinois, which then had a population of about 12 million. So you're looking at 6 million roughly. So 6 million roughly about Philly metro sized.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So then I think also to set the stage for we talk more about how the development changed after the 60s and things like this. Could you talk about briefly what a nuclear facility even is and where it falls in the conversation of green fuel or not? You know, how much falls?
Yes, and nuclear, it is very much. So if you take a spectrum of power generation from firm to flexible, nuclear is very much on the firm side, as in you have, just like any plants that have a steam boiler, since pretty much every nuclear plant today uses a steam cycle for power generation. So you have a nuclear reactor, and what that does is you run water through it. It becomes steam. Again, the specifics vary based on the actual design, but basically you're just heating steam to 300 some degrees Celsius, much like a coal or a natural gas combined cycle plant.
Okay.
Again, that's the difference. And it drives a turbine, and then that generates electricity. So that's really how it operates. And it generally takes a pretty long time to ramp up if you have to get it up from a cold start, or if you have to follow loads. So typically you just keep the plant going unless you need to refuel or otherwise undertake some plant maintenance. You keep that plant just running 24/7 as much as possible. So then the trouble there is you're then have to figure out when the load is low, like during overnight hours, where that additional power is going to go. So there are pluses that it's definitely firm. It provides reliable power 24/7. The minus is that it's not flexible at all.
Okay. All right, good. So now we're in the 60s.
Yeah.
And we have several plants, some with a single and some with multiple reactors, mostly concentrated in Illinois.
No, not just in Illinois. So Illinois was one of them. But there were most of the plants then were either were in the Midwest, Southeast, and Northeast. Those are the early ones.
Reasons for that? Does it need a significant access to water or just
Well, you're for just like wherever, if you're siting a coal or a natural gas plant, you do need some way to cool the facility. So water, of course, is indeed a situation. That said, what nuclear plants in Arizona, they actually use treated wastewater, so it becomes far less of an issue. So water is definitely a constraint. But back in the 60s, the concern was more about where is the load growth going to be, that there's going to be increase in the 60s. There was expected because of widespread electrification in the 60s. There was expected to be large load growth going forward. And thus, that was why many utilities, even many of the smaller ones, felt justified in building new nuclear plants to support additional load.
Okay, so that provided the demand was that there was a conversation among the utilities in the United States where they said there's going to be an outsized demand for
That's right.
electricity that we need to meet.
Right.
And nuclear is
Right. So nuclear was one of them. And nuclear was, of course, and again, it played well in the 60s, given with the rise of the environmental movement, then the resurgence that nuclear has zero emissions at the operating plant level, unlike coal or gas power plants. So that was a key advantage. And they also, of course, they didn't have as much material throughput as needed. So if you make a comparison, if you basically have a fistful of uranium, as in lightly enriched uranium, as a nuclear reactor fuel for power generation purposes, just a fistful of that can provide enough energy as a pile of coal as big as a two-story house.
wow. Okay, so then we're in the 60s. Nuclear has these advantages over fossil fuel. Also has the momentum from the environmental movement.
Yeah.
What happens as far as deployment and building and utilization?
Yeah, so as we move into the 70s, so by the early 70s, by 73, 74, that period, already there were over 100 orders for new plants. So some had multiple reactors, others had only one reactor. And about 40 some utilities across the country had active plant orders at that time. And what started happening was that these nuclear plants, some of those early ones, they started running over budget and running over schedule. And one of the biggest drawbacks then of how nuclear deployment happened in the US from the late 60s and the early 70s was that the different utilities, all of them had a somewhat bespoke design of a nuclear plant.
Every single one.
Almost every single one. They had specifications that were bespoke enough that there wasn't much of a learning curve. That Whereas, for example, like learning curve is such that as you keep repeating builds, it's often said that every doubling of installed capacity for any power plant would, especially if it was a relatively new technology like nuclear was back then, would result in anywhere from a 10, 15, maybe even 20% reduction in unit costs as you keep adding capacity. As you keep. So there are two economies of scale. So one economy of scale is bigger and bigger plants, as in because no matter how big or how small your nuclear plant is, you still need the balance of plant in place. And those don't vary as much as the size of the facility cost-wise. So the bigger the capacity of a nuclear reactor is, then the higher total cost is, but the lower your unit cost per unit of capacity is going to be.
But but there is a limit, I would assume, physically or financially big a certain plant can be.
There is indeed a limit to that, though. Again, there was only one back in my own research. There were very few studies that actually demonstrated there was any type of diseconomy of scale as you get bigger. And even with that study, it's only when you get bigger than a gigawatt where you maybe could see some diseconomy of scale. But typically more so, even if you compare where most nuclear reactor vendors settled on today, it's much closer to 1.5 gigawatts and 1 gigawatt. So bigger plants, if you really want to have a maximum economy of scale, bigger plants, not just bigger plants, but your second economy of scale is you'll need to build that same plant over and over so you can realize the learning effects. And the big miss that US utilities in the early 70s made was having a bespoke design. So there wasn't that learning effect from repeat builds.
Fascinating. So then you had said at this point there is somewhere between 100 and 150. You said orders?
Orders for plants.
And 40 that were in process.
So if you were to take all the plant orders, that at one point there were at least 170, 180, even close to 200 reactors on order.
And an order is something that is submitted waiting to be approved by some body.
Right, so basically an order would be anything that has come up for permitting, as in a utility. So again, go back to early 70s. This was before electricity markets were partly deregulated. And though some states still have tightly regulated electricity markets, especially in the Southeast. But back then, that was when pretty much every region in the US still had traditionally regulated utilities. So what a utility would do is they would file a petition to the state Public Service Commission. So typically those are the regulators for new power generation or water generation or any type of infrastructure. And they'll make a case that we need additional capacity because under a regulated system, utilities are allowed to recover the capital cost of building new capacity through charging higher rates to customers. So that's why they need to petition the State Public Service Commission to approve a rate increase so they can fund new capacity additions.
That's what you mean by order.
Order, yes. So they filed for permits to build a plant. And as many of them as they were approved, about a third of them never actually ended up happening. And mostly because they were just simply canceled, that for a number of reasons. So as we progressed into the 70s, first, the load growth that was projected back in the 60s, it was far lower than with projection.
Oh, I see.
So by the late 70s, it turned out the justification for new plants became a lot weaker. And in fact, actually, until 2007, so for a whole 33 years, a third of a century, from 1974 until roughly 2007, 2008, there were no orders in the United States for any new nuclear plants.
Was that because the environment just didn't support it, or was it because of this Lotos conversation? Like, what was it backlog?
So this was before there were changes in the regulatory environment, because that only happened in the late 70s, where there were changes in the regulatory environment that made permitting a lot more stringent.
So it wasn't strictly people said don't build.
No, this was before, and it wasn't even the necessarily regulators making it very hard. It was that many of these utilities, they just, and even to this day, for many utilities, especially back then, the cost of building one of those nuclear plants, the amount of equity needed to build a nuclear plant, in some cases, was already close to half the market capitalization of any of those utilities. So already what was already doing is that, well, if you're in that situation, if you need to put half your market cap as equity in a new power plant, then that is going to cause some issues with your ability to raise funds.
Okay.
And yes, and indeed, it said that half, in fact, if you take the 40-some overall, I think 47 or 48, however many utilities that actually filed to build nuclear plants, half of them either ended up insolvent and liquidating, or being forced into an acquisition by a much bigger utility, and 40 of them had their credit ratings downgraded by at least a full letter.
Wow. This is in the late 70s?
Since the 70s. Over time, because what happened in the 70s is that because of cost overruns, that many of these utilities, they started running out of budget. And again, as people might know, pretty much throughout the 70s was an era of high inflation in the US, typically high single digits, low double digits in the 70s. So with the high inflation, what had been budgeted as outlays quickly was eaten up by rising price of inputs. So many of these utilities, they had no other option but to keep delaying, which again, costs just kept going up. So some of those plants, what one would expect to take only 5 or 6 years, end up taking 10 or even 15 years to complete.
Okay, so then if we could spin up a little bow.
Yeah.
So we went from effectively the 1950s in the U.S.
Yes.
when nuclear became viable enough for there to be an argument to commercially deploy.
Right.
The 60s, where there was first deployment, second deployment, there's confirmation that this could work.
Right.
And then in the late 60s, there was a projection of the load growth that validated or justified the investment in nuclear through the beginning of the 70s, and then a combination of inflation and that load growth not realizing.
Right. And a lot of that load growth was thanks to, was a combination of two factors. One was very high because projections in the 60s, they were still projecting mid to high single digit GDP growth.
Okay.
So they were expecting load growth to persist.
Okay.
And then in the stagflation area of the 70s, GDP growth fell flat. Therefore, there wasn't as much demand as once projected. And what deadened that load growth even further were post-1973 oil crisis efficiency measures.
So before we get into what nuclear is now, or the resurgence of interest in it,
Yeah.
like that, can you speak at all to the publicity aspect of nuclear? Because it's gone back and forth as far as what its reputation.
Well, there was at one point a resurgence, and if you go back 20 years, if you look into papers from 20 years ago, even journal articles in many engineering magazines, they were proclaiming a nuclear renaissance is coming. And this was 20 years back.
Okay.
And that was on the heel. So you could take, if you zoom out again with the whole history, with early nuclear plants, you could say those were your generation 1 reactors. So even before there was a commercial reactor in Shippingport, Pennsylvania, the first reactor that actually produced any electricity for commercial purposes was one a year prior in the UK, Calder Hall.
Okay.
And both in both the US and UK, there were a bunch of these Gen 1 builds, as they say, which were, again, direct derivatives of naval reactor designs. Then most reactors operating today are what are called Generation 2.
Ooh.
So Gen 2, so those were the 500 megawatt to 1 gigawatt reactors that more or less settled on the technology of light water reactors. And back in the 50s and 60s, there were many competing technologies, especially because back then there was a concern that uranium is very scarce.
Right.
So we need to be able to create new fissile material for nuclear reactors. And it turned out that that uranium wasn't as close as scarce as
What was that about uranium?
uranium. It was in the 60s when
It's not.
is not as scarce as initially believed. So that was why the utilities for commercial reactors, they settled on light water reactor technology.
Okay.
So there is that generation 2.
Right.
Then in the 90s, so again, while the US stopped building reactors, in the 90s, though, that was when nuclear construction was still across East Asia going on. So Japan, South Korea, mostly Japan in those days. And you had what are called Generation 3. So they had the same underlying architecture as Generation 2 reactors, but enhancements like passive cooling and much more robust safety systems and the like. And then in the early noughts, early after 2000, there was this class called Gen 3 Plus, as they say. So think Gen 3, right, think Gen 3 with further enhancements. And
You're saying that was here that occurred?
around the world. So if you go back 20 years, the Gen 3 Plus designs, Westinghouse had the AP1000. General Electric had their new generation of advanced boiling water reactors. And then in Europe, Areva, well, back then they were called Areva, now renamed Orano after restructuring. Yeah, Areva, back when they were called Areva, then they were a consortium behind the European pressurized reactor, or EPR. So you had those 3 different light water reactor designs that were what were called Gen 3 Plus. And on the regulatory side, it converged with the rollout of what are called early site permits. So if you already have a site for a nuclear reactor, you can get permitted for one even if you don't actually have one under planning. You can actually get that site pre-permitted. This was about 20 years ago in the US. Early site permit coupled with combined licensing. So because previously with if you wanted to build a nuclear plant, you need to apply for a site license and an operating license separately.
Why was there interest from a regulatory perspective to make nuclear easier, I guess, or to put momentum into the nuclear space? And
There's been, it's like nuclear, where it fulfilled was a point of consensus amongst advocacy groups that otherwise tended to disagree, sometimes vehemently, with each other.
Okay.
So for as far as nuclear is concerned, because it generated no emissions, that it was acceptable, not to all, but to quite many environmental groups. It was quite acceptable because it generated no emissions. It also fulfilled those who were trying to champion energy security, as in having domestic power production.
But there's also the aspect I mentioned earlier is the aspect of what nuclear's reputation is, because there have been a few nuclear catastrophes that.
Well, there has been, again, to be clear about those, the one reactor, the one situation that has really led to significant mass casualties on site was Chernobyl. That type of reactor design, from the get-go, was never permissible anywhere in the US because that reactor had no containment shell. So, and it also had a positive void coefficient as well, that reactor, where, because like a void coefficient, just to explain it simply, is that normally, let's say if you superheat water that cycles through a reactor, once it's superheated, you may form bubbles or voids.
Okay.
So void coefficient is, as voids form, what happens to the nuclear reaction. So a positive void coefficient means that with voids, the reaction level increases. With negative, it decreases. And in fact, from the get-go, reactors with the positive void coefficient have been illegal to construct in the US from the get-go. So Chernobyl wasn't really an issue there. It was a design issue that was complicated by operator error.
Got it. And that design that is inherently flawed, like you're saying, is not allowed to carry forward.
Right. And then if we go back to the big significant mishap that triggered evacuations, which was 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, just to southeast of Harrisburg. That incident, what really happened was the safety systems, they did in fact, it was called a loss of heatsink. So there wasn't any place to reject any decay heat. So for example, as in there was an overheating, so the water was boiled away. So therefore there was an overheating, some parts of the reactor unit melted, but it was contained. Because it had a containment, it was contained within the pressure vessel. So that was the worst it ever got in the States. And then now, no, it was a precaution. They evacuated as a precaution. There was some release of radioactivity, but minimal compared to, say, Chernobyl or even Fukushima over in Japan, which that situation was also a design issue, in which, in a coastal area, putting backup generators underground susceptible to flooding when there's a tsunami, as opposed to putting them above ground on the rooftop units of a reactor. Yeah.
So clear the name of nuclear. Those three, I guess those three major cases, they all have reasons, and they are all considered in today's environment of constructive.
Right. Exactly. And with those, there really isn't anything, because I think the thing with nuclear is that it's a lot easier, because any pollution that comes from a nuclear plant comes out in the form of solids, as in spent fuel, which in fact, with the light water reactor designs, you still have 95% of the latent energy still available in the spent fuel.
Huge. Actually, a question I was going to
Yeah.
get into after I finished the timeline was that recently on an episode with this guy who runs Nucleation Capital, I believe they're based in Florida or something like that. They invest in modular nuclear, and that's something that he brought up as well, was that there is a lot of potential energy still left in what we dispose of. In the
Correct.
nuclear process.
It's there, and then that was actually a motivation about just over 20 years ago. That was actually a motivation for what were called Generation 4 reactors. So the difference between Gen 4 and Gen 3 is that Generation 4, that was when it seemed so that alternative to the once through fuel cycle with light water reactors, it seemed to be on the horizon, as in having a closed loop fuel cycle. So that was with Gen 4, and it was, and there were several designs, and actually the technology themselves have been around since the 50s in labs.
So now we're here at the 2000s.
Yes.
And like you're speaking to, we're at Gen 4 of the stage of nuclear innovation.
Yes.
And we went through this period where there was not development in the U.S.
At least in the U.S. There were reactors being built elsewhere in the world at the same time, but there weren't any orders in the U.S.
All right. So take us from there. Where do we go from here?
Okay. And with this whole nuclear renaissance talk about 20 years ago, what often came up in that period was, while nuclear power plant construction trailed off in the US as we got into the 80s, in France, that was when they really started picking up.
France?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's a big difference in how things are approached, because France was the only example, only place where nuclear actually successfully displaced fossil fuels.
Really?
Yes. Because what France managed to do that the US couldn't was to reduce its oil dependence by any conceivable amount.
Okay.
Because if you take French energy, if you take the total primary energy demand in France, primary energy and production in France, go back in the early 70s, 2/3 was in petroleum. By the mid to late 1990s, it was down to 1/3. And all of that, of course, there were also efficiency measures, but the actual displacement was thanks to nuclear power. That what France did and the US did not do was concentrate on a single design of nuclear reactor.
Okay.
Different capacities, so not all plants had to be exactly the same size, so it had 3 different sizes roughly. As they got into the later builds, as we got into the Gen 3 Plus after 2000, they also started having issues with cost overruns and schedule overruns with the new ones. And what that really points to is, for nuclear, you needed a whole host of factors in place in order to deploy nuclear successfully. That you're going to need government buy-in from the top level down.
Okay.
Also, standard design, so you can do repeat builds. And then, furthermore, you would also need a supportive supplier ecosystem around the plants. And that's something you can only maintain if you're building nuclear plants relatively continuously.
Okay.
As opposed to stop-start.
Is there any place that has been doing that?
Well, the one place that has so far come the closest to it, so France is a historic example. A current example that hasn't quite gotten there, they might be able to do so, but there's grounds to believe it's not going to happen is China. That they've had a pretty good construction rate in terms of a new nuclear reactor coming along every month or two. However, they've still been consistently, like with nuclear deployment, has consistently been below targets government set.
Okay.
And what is actually calls for concern about, can they sustain this? Can they work their way down the cost curve further, even though costs are pretty manageable so far because of high construction rate? They have the ecosystem in place. They have that economy of scale there.
Okay.
But the fact that they're also trying to export a wide range of designs does not bode well going forward.
As we've established with the USA and France, like you're saying.
Right. And
Okay.
then that also gets to concern now with small modular reactors, which is same thing as larger reactors. You're going to need to focus on one design, choose a design, and build it over and over.
So have SMRs, small modular reactors, has that become more popular? I know they've been around for a long time, but have they become more popular and potentially more viable, or at least more of an interest, attracting capital, regulatory interest, all of these things in the last 15 years or so? Would that be accurate?
You could even trace it back a lot longer, since if you go back 20 years, there was study after study about different designs of small modular reactors.
What point did companies start creating and new technologies start being deployed, pilots, things like that?
You can go back around 20 years ago when there was a lot of talk then about a nuclear renaissance, that this notion that the fuel cycle, that the spent fuel issue can be solved.
Okay.
And what has always impeded, reason that it was always impeded, it was that there was really never a strong pure economic argument for it, that you can make arguments around national security or materials or anything about managing a spent fuel issue.
So we're in the 2000s. So my last question, you brought up SMR.
Yeah.
And we brought up the fact that up to the 2000s, there were not new projects commissioned. Have there been since the mid 2000s, since this increased interest in SMRs, any new large scale nuclear projects commissioned?
Yes, there have been, and as mentioned earlier, the two places where nuclear plants have still been commissioned at a fairly rapid pace were China and South Korea. And at least until the Fukushima incident, even Japan, as in until then, Japan had a distinction of being one of the countries that never, ever since the nuclear build-out began in Japan, never actually had any gap year where there were no nuclear plants under construction.
Wow.
Yes, so all the way up till Fukushima.
Okay.
That then prompted...
That's crazy.
Yes. So Japan was one of the few. South Korea, they also had fairly continuous build-out.
Okay.
And so did China, even though they started a bit later.
So how about the U.S.? While China, Japan, and South Korea were doing so, was there anything that the rest of the world was able to learn from the rapid deployment of nuclear in those three countries?
Well, the deployments validated lessons from the French examples, that if you have a standardized design, a robust supply chain, you have a robust ecosystem of suppliers around the whole nuclear value chain. You have support from all the way from the top of the government, which in France there was consensus around it. You had direct top-down government support. You needed those in place in order to actually conduct a rapid deployment of nuclear, of being able to even potentially even get plants complete in 4 to 5 years, and that's only if you were to incorporate modular construction techniques,
Okay.
which would be justified again
Interesting.
only when you have a high construction volume.
Okay.
And that was one of the original arguments why SMRs could be viable, that they're smaller, but you build more units, so perhaps you can work your way down the learning curve faster. What is problematic about that, though, is for a nuclear plant, a reactor isn't always necessarily your biggest cost object. Especially if your reactor is smaller. Even if you have a small reactor, what increase your costs even more significantly with a smaller reactor is the balance of plant.
Okay.
That you'll still need power generating equipment. And even besides that, let's say even if you size your power generating equipment smaller, and let's say they're then cheaper to acquire, you're still going to need fixed costs in terms of layers of defense around the perimeter.
Right.
Like no matter how big or small your reactor is.
Okay.
So that's the shortcoming. And given those requirements, anyone looking to build small modular reactors would really do well to focus on sites where there are already existing reactors, because otherwise you're going to have to put in these layers of defense again.
Interesting. So, I think that's extremely interesting that because it seems very nuanced, that piece of friction that could hurt someone or a company's ability to bring this modular technology um, to the market. So I think that's very interesting. My follow-up question to that is, what are your thoughts about the evolution of particular the technology itself, how the fusion is happening? Because there's been innovations and there's a bunch of different approaches in SMRs and those different technologies. So what do you think about that?
So there have been waves of interest in SMRs. So you got the 50s, you have the 70s till to the 80s and 90s. Another wave from about 20 years ago, and we're seeing now there's a surge that now, thanks to, again, it's almost like a replay of where things were 50, 60 years ago, that load growth again because of data centers. Again, don't know exactly how it's going to turn out, but what is very likely is that there's plenty of calls for caution around that, because especially with data centers, given how quickly, compared to power generation, data centers, given how quickly, especially thermal power generation, given how quickly technology behind chipsets and data centers evolve, within 3 years, the data center that's just put up today may end up being obsolete. You're going to have to completely refit it because those chips go obsolete in 3 years. Given where things stand because of high power requirements, there is a very high likelihood that more and more companies will shift towards much more efficient computing models in response.
But what is the real okay? So this is a huge
Yeah,
theme in clean tech, I think, in general
right.
right now, is the fact that how much money is going to AI, therefore how much money is going into data centers, therefore how much money is going into grid modification, renewables, different energy sources, these types of things. Because through the Trojan horse of data centers, it becomes economically now not just feasible, but a requirement to diversify your power sources to make sure that you're not over reliant on any particular
That's right.
data centers. So, what do you think about the application of these energy sources outside of the data center application? Do
So-
we need these anyway, or is this only happening because of this data center?
So big drivers, data centers,
Right.
and even that is somewhat mismatched because running a data center, yes, you're going to need to have availability, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have the same load
Mhm.
24/7. And if your load is going to vary basically hourly on an hourly basis, nuclear is not at all a good fit for it because nuclear is best matched with steady load 24/7.
So why is there such a heavy investment? Like I just read today, like we were talking about that a bunch of the major tech firms have been making major investments in nuclear, and Meta hasn't until very recently. This last week, they announced a very significant investment um, in a big nuclear company. And so, if that's true? You know what you're saying. Why is there so much attention from big tech in nuclear?
When largely with big tech, again, one assumption is, well, even if you have say nuclear power plants, there is an operating assumption that even when load is low, you could still send the power somewhere else. That even the implication with Google, with them acquiring a power generation company, is you can actually then turn yourself into a utility potentially. So from what I observe, and this is just my outside observation about this, for the tech companies, they just are looking for ways of fundamentally more so of option value, as in potentially this is going to pay off or it might not. And especially now, given this rush into data centers, the fact that if you want a gas turbine, now the wait time is 4 years. And what some of those developers of small modular reactors, and even let alone small modular reactors, even some of the larger reactors, what they're promising is a new nuclear plant can be brought online within 7 years. So, well, if you still already need to wait 4 years for gas turbines, wait 3 more years and you can have a nuclear available.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically firm power, it's zero emission in particular, and effectively in general with nuclear. If you look at the overall track record, and one reason why many of these developers of these new nuclear reactor designs have actually been getting some traction with the big tech firms is they're willing to pay a pretty high premium for power that would then justify the high levelized costs of those first plants of that first design, as in 20-30 cents a kilowatt hour.
Okay, so with all this
Yeah.
context and with these little things that we sprinkled in, uh, two things. The first thing that I want to return to is this concept of the closed loop
Yeah.
using the nuclear waste as a secondary power source.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about just short about the history of it, where it came from, and has there been an actual application of it?
Well, the closest, the furthest any case you find anywhere, that the furthest any entity has gone in reprocessing of spent fuel is, again, goes back to Arriva, so in French, that what they have actually been doing for decades now is reprocessing spent fuel into what's called a mixed oxide fuel. So it's not just uranium oxides, but also plutonium and other so-called transuranic elements. So elements that are heavier than uranium on the periodic table.
Okay.
So they've been doing that, and you don't actually get that much through the current process. You don't actually get that much more yield in terms of power. Instead of 4 or 5%, like 3 to 4%, maybe 5% of the energy in lightly enriched uranium that you're going to have available. You're more so maybe 5, 6%.
Okay.
So it's somewhat of an improvement, but not too much. And again, the biggest drawback has been because the price of uranium has never really been consistently high enough to justify an alternative to the ones through fuel cycle for commercial purposes.
Interesting.
There really isn't any justification, at least on a pure financial and commercial standpoint.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So from a science perspective, physics perspective, chemistry perspective,
Right.
it is possible, but it doesn't yield that much more fuel.
Based on how the French do it now,
Okay.
there have been other technologies that would require new reactor designs that can have higher yield in terms of how much can be reprocessed. So, in fact, if you dive further back from the 70s until early 90s, there was a reactor called the EBR-2, the Experimental Breeder Reactor, over in Idaho, that was used to test a closed-loop fuel cycle. That was very safe by design. It had passive safety features, so it's already, even in the 80s, far safer than even many of the nuclear designs today. How quickly it shut down whenever there was a loss of heat sink or loss of coolant flow.
Sure.
And also, the main constraint then was you needed fully remote handling of the fuel, which today, thanks to advances in automation, it's not a difficult problem to solve.
Okay.
Now, the challenge with that, though, is, again, it goes back to what is the justification? That it's great to have that spent fuel available as a strategic energy reserve, but other than that, what's the additional benefit?
So does it just come down to the fact that you can't make a lot of money off of making fuel of the waste, so it's more economically viable to just store it or put it away?
Right. That's exactly why. And it's actually why it goes back to why, for any successful nuclear deployment, you never actually had a successful deployment of nuclear power without heavy top-down government direction.
Hmm.
That you're saying, if you want nuclear deployment at mass scale, you're going to need very aggressive intervention from the top down
But
government.
like from a like an actual standpoint of the reality of how things get done, isn't that, and this is very naive because I don't know anything about this actually, but isn't that the same thing as, for example, like the automotive industry? Very heavily subsidized by the government, and if it wasn't as heavily subsidized as it is, it makes no economic sense to make or produce cars.
Well,
the way
there
they do.
there are some differences, though. Again, there's some similarities in operating principles, but the key difference is that compared to automotive, if you compare the volume for, let's say, in 1 year, 80 to 90, say, if you just look at passenger cars, maybe 80 million. If you count commercial vehicles, maybe 90 million. How many motor vehicles are produced around the world every year?
No idea.
90 million.
Okay.
Roughly speaking, 90 million, roughly. If you compare that to how many nuclear plants have been built around the world so far, at last count, let's say if you even count those that were built and shut down, not even 1,000.
Eh?
Not even 1,000, and that's already over 75 years.
Okay.
Not even 1,000, whereas 90 million cars get assembled
A year.
a year.
Okay.
So therefore, let's say with cars, it's actually why in the automotive industries, you can have multiple players that are significant. Let's say Toyota, GM, Volkswagen, each of them between 8 to 10 million cars a year they manufacture, give or take. At that level, learning curve, you can easily work your way down the cost curve. At that level, at that level of production.
Okay.
Whereas
I see where you're coming from.
for nuclear, many fewer builds And because every nuclear plant, it's actually said that for nuclear, there are a lot more what are called long tail risks
Got it.
of building a nuclear plant
We
than
talked
assembling a
about
car.
this, right? That
Yeah.
book by the Danish
Bent,
professor.
Bent Flyvbjerg.
What's the name of that book?
It's
Something about project management.
right. So it's his. No, he's actually published. It's not just a book, but he's published multiple papers
Got it. Okay.
that look into different types of mega projects.
Yes.
And
Super interesting.
so, and the one category of projects even with even greater long tail risks than a nuclear power plant is nuclear spent fuel management.
Really?
Yes.
So, okay. All right. Well, I appreciate you going through that because that was definitely
Because you have a lot more of the long
interesting.
tail risks with nuclear in terms of what can trigger
right.
a massive budget or schedule blowout.
Sure. But so well, okay, I'll just ask, where are we now and where are we going?
So
nuclear?
so right now with nuclear, so if we're looking at the current context, is what makes sense is already what no one can honestly deny is that even with the somewhat, relatively speaking, limited rollout of nuclear, maybe with the exception of France, but nuclear rollout has far undershot what its proponents in 50-60s promised. That, and even some say, even actually some I know who who has been in this industry, he even said that, especially in the US, that the nuclear industry and was stillborn, as he called it.
Okay.
And this was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
He put that label on. So where you stand now is, for nuclear, what is the most viable approach is, with the exception of some of the older nuclear plants, which already there are requiring increasingly high maintenance expenses, that if you were to need to upgrade them or overhaul them, sometimes, in some cases, it wouldn't actually justify keeping it going. But other than those, the vast majority of reactors operating in the world today, that they could readily continue to operate for at least a few more decades.
Okay.
Because what has actually been proven is that, over operating records, is that for a nuclear plant, that an operating life of a nuclear plant, instead of 40 years, could in fact be extended up to 60 years without any significant safety issues.
That's like recent research?
Yes, it's research that has been done from the 90s onwards, when the first nuclear plants, the first builds in the US, they were nearing end of life as in originally permitted.
Okay.
And then there were a spate of them that applied for spate of operators that applied for life extensions. So keeping those running ensures that we'll still have that low carbon generation available.
So then that deals with the large existing plants that are operating. But how about the state of the SMRs like we talked about?
So don't count on any SMR being available before 2030. Given especially where they're now, that most of them will still require certification. And let's say even if you expedite the construction process post-certification, still, the very earliest you can get a nuclear plant running, like even in the best case scenario, if you were to start planning one right now, the very best case scenario would be end of 2030.
Yeah.
That would be your very best case scenario.
Got it.
So what makes sense is, yes, keep those existing plants running.
Okay.
If you're looking to add additional power supply between now and 2030, look at what China is doing now, because what has happened is, even as nuclear in China chronically undershot targets in terms of build out, that at one point they were targeting in the 20 years ago, they were trying to go for one nuclear plant every month. The best they were able to maintain was one nuclear plant every 2 months.
That's still so. That sounds like such an insane number of plants. Still,
Right, and that wasn't too far off. That's even if you just by population, that's not too far off
Yeah.
from France's build out from the late 70s till the early 90s.
so I guess to help put a nice end to this whole journey
Yeah.
of nuclear that we've been on, where does and this is an opinion question,
Yeah.
so subjectively, where does nuclear fall as far as building a grid, building a society, a world, however you want to take it, where we're utilizing resources from the planet responsibly
Yeah.
and creating societies that are sustainable in
Right.
that way. So where does it fall relative to the other technologies?
So if we look at nuclear, nuclear, the biggest benefit from nuclear is the fact that there are already plants running, and most of them can run for a few more decades without any adverse issues,
Okay.
safety-wise. That's a big benefit right there already.
Okay.
Now, for anything additional to that, and this is just purely looking at if you're going to need to justify to any private investor around power, there's a good reason why China, they've been increasingly weighting their efforts towards solar, wind, and batteries. Because those types of generators, unlike nuclear, unlike coal, unlike gas, those are modular by design. That there is no risk. Like, even if you have a nuclear, coal, or gas plant, even if it's 99% or point however many 9% complete, you can't operate it. Whereas solar or wind, even if you get it barely a quarter or even 10% complete, you just have a smaller facility. You can already be generating income. And because you have so many builds, as in it's very well suited to mass production, like automobiles, for example.
Sure.
Like if you're building solar plants or wind plants, those work a lot more like automobiles, as in you have parts that are could be widely interchangeable, very commonly used, that it's very easy to get online once you have the site ready.
Cool.
And they're also, especially with batteries, they're also very flexible. So you can very easily match the amount of power generated according to actual demand.
Yeah.
So if you actually want additional load, is actually quite low-hanging fruit would be distributed generation
Across multiple kinds of technologies,
like distributed generation, as in enabling distributing that you would have especially large industrial customers have on-site power generation.
Okay.
And also the cheapest right now, by far the cheapest form of power right now, like even if you just take it on a levelized cost basis, utility scale, solar and wind, even with battery storage, you're still going to beat gas, you're definitely going to beat coal, and you're definitely going to beat new nuclear on a levelized cost basis. So nuclear is great given that you already have that installed base in place. Going forward, again, maybe 20 years ago, it was a different question because that was when solar and wind was still at a pretty significant premium back then.
Right.
Now, if we compare today, given that the price of solar and wind has fallen by over 80% on the hardware, even 90% in some cases, then if you're really an investor in this, if you're looking at what is the best use of funds as far as energy is concerned, you'd go with what can be deployed very quickly and economically.
Yangbo, is there any? So you answer all my questions. Phenomenally. This is an amazing conversation. I learned so much. Before my last question, is there anything that you feel needs to be added in order to round out this conversation about nuclear?
Well, to really paint a picture of what a climate smart solution around energy supply could look like, if we take all of the resources, let's say if you take the whole European continent, and there are fits and starts, but they're now going in the direction of actually integrating the grid at the continental level much better. Much like what China has been doing for decades by now, is doing continental scale grid integration. So if you take Europe, for example, France, what is more useful to think in terms of France's situation is in France, about 3/4 electricity in France comes from nuclear.
Mm.
And in fact,
Today.
today, yes. In fact, in France, they have so much power, so much electricity from nuclear that even with exports of electricity during low demand hours to neighboring countries, there's still nuclear plants in France that must be ramped down because there just isn't any place to go.
Wow.
So about a third of their plants actually do load following, which of course they're not exactly designed to do. So therefore, some of those have incurred some unplanned maintenance outages as of late.
All right.
However, let's say, but if you take the continental scale of Europe, instead of thinking 3/4 of French capacity, well, those nuclear plants in France, that would be a pretty good 10% of a future zero carbon European grid. So that would be your firm capacity that runs 24/7 no matter what. And with better grid integration across borders, you can then send that power where it needs to be. So, for example, in France, you have your nuclear plants. Over in the North Sea, you have a lot of wind potential for offshore wind. You have, like anywhere in Europe, plenty of opportunity for distributed solar generation, plus utility scale if you're in Spain, Italy, Greece, or Turkey. Further north in Scandinavia and the Alps, you have a lot of energy storage potential in terms of pump hydro. So if you connect all of those energy generation and energy storage resource together with a grid, with a continental scale grid, that's actually where you can see what is the most appropriate role of a nuclear reactor fleet.
That is wonderful. Does that concept, and very well said, well done. Does that two things? Does that concept apply to the US as well?
It very equally does. It's that the difference in the US is the US is a lot further behind than Europe, and even further yet behind China in terms of the grid situation.
So is it actively happening in Europe that they're looking to connect across borders and make it like a continental scale?
Yes, it is active, and lately there has been much greater push to it, especially in response to escalation of war against Ukraine. And a reminder that war started back in 2014
Yeah,
when Crimea was annexed,
right.
and then also parts of the Donbass and eastern Ukraine were annexed. So with that escalation in February 2022, it served as a greater impetus for Europe
Sure.
to reduce dependency on gas.
Right. Yeah, got it. All right.
And better grid integration is part of that.
Well, that's a good framing of, I think, ultimately where if slash when, I guess depending on who you are,
Yeah.
nuclear comes into being a major and stable player in the mix of energy generation. So I appreciate you adding that on top because that's really awesome. So my last question for you is with all this work that you're doing, because we haven't even talked about, this has only been about nuclear. Haven't talked about anything you're doing now, which we will. We'll get to future episodes. What inspires you?
Well, for me, it's always about it's pretty consistently it's we making every next day better somewhere in the world. That there's never going to be any form of an end state. So don't be deluded by any talk about that there's any end of history or anything like that. It's always a matter of continuous improvement. That just realizing that pretty much every single problem we're seeing right now, it's been solved by someone somewhere in the world already. So it's really all about learning from what's already exists, and even some cases, what has been solved decades ago,
Yep.
has been understood decades ago, and just understanding that there's a lot more similar, there's a lot more that can be learned than differences might suggest at the surface.
Well, that's beautiful. I'm going to capture that. I'm going to quote it. I'm going to frame it. I'm going to put it on my wall. If anyone else was inspired, what's the best way to follow along with your journey or get in touch with you?
Well, you could very easily find me online. Probably the only one that actually has much of an online presence, someone with my name. So,
Nice, and that would be Yangbo Do
yes, yeah, if you just type my name in and
on LinkedIn.
on LinkedIn, or even if you just do a Google search,
I
it'll,
Google.
it'll probably come up.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This is so much of it, and I'm so grateful for it. And I'm excited for future episodes.
Likewise.